The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the small town of Maple Creek. It was one of those serene autumn evenings that made the air feel crisp, yet comforting. The sky above was a muted orange, a perfect end to an almost too quiet day. Michigan, known for its dense forests and tranquil lakes, had always been a peaceful place, especially in the fall. The streets of Maple Creek were lined with homes, their porches decorated with pumpkins and wreaths, as families prepared for Halloween. For most of the town, it was just another evening to wind down. But for one young woman, Emily Turner, that evening marked the beginning of a nightmare that would shake Maple Creek to its core. Emily had always been a free spirit, someone who enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature. She often went hiking alone in the dense woods that surrounded the town, something she found peaceful after long days filled with the chaos of her job and the demands of her family. She was an outdoors enthusiast, and the forest had always been her escape. That evening, Emily had set off into the woods with her usual pack. Light, just enough to get through a few hours. She told her friends she'd be back before dark. But as the night grew colder and darker, the worry began to set in. Emily didn't come back. Her absence was unlike her, and by the time the clock struck midnight, her friends were already out looking for her. They searched the paths she usually walked, calling her name into the silent woods, but the only sound that echoed back was the rustling of the wind through the branches. As the hours passed, more and more people became involved in the search. Local police, volunteers, and even a few brave souls from the town joined in. They spread out across the forest, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, shining on the thick underbrush and towering trees. But no matter how deep they ventured, there was no sign of Emily. The woods, which had once felt so familiar to her, now seemed foreign and hostile. By morning, the search had expanded. The town was on edge. The sheriff's department had already contacted the state police, and the news had spread quickly. Local news stations began reporting about the missing woman, and soon, the entire county was gripped by the news. People feared the worst, but no one dared to say it out loud. The thought that Emily could be lost, or worse, something sinister could have happened, was too much to bear. It wasn't until the afternoon of the second day that something was finally found. A group of searchers, cutting through a thicket on the edge of a more remote part of the woods, stumbled upon a piece of cloth. It was an old rag, dirty and stained with what looked like blood. The rag was almost buried beneath a pile of leaves, and at first the searchers thought it was nothing more than a discarded piece of trash. But when one of the volunteers reached down to move the leaves, they saw it. A deep red stain that soaked the rag through. The air immediately thickened with tension. The cloth wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill through the group. They couldn't ignore it. Someone had been here, and there was blood. The local police immediately flagged the area as a potential crime scene, marking off the area with yellow tape and beginning a more focused search. They scoured the vicinity around the rag, but they found nothing else. No footprints, no further evidence, and no sign of Emily. That's when things began to feel really strange. The rag was the only clue they had, but it seemed to lead them to more questions than answers. The deeper they searched, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees, once majestic and welcoming, now seemed to close in on them, casting dark shadows across the trail. The sense of unease grew with every step they took, and the feeling that something was watching them became undeniable. As the days turned into weeks, the search efforts intensified. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew over the thick forest canopy, and divers scoured nearby lakes and streams. But still, no sign of Emily. It was as though she had simply vanished, swallowed by the woods. The sheriff's department brought in experts, forensic teams, and even a group of psychics, hoping for any kind of lead. They combed through the area, over and over, retracing their steps, but nothing new came to light. The town of Maple Creek, which had once been filled with the laughter of children and the chatter of friendly neighbors, was now silent. People gathered in small groups, whispering about what might have happened to Emily. Everyone had their theories. Some thought she had fallen into a ravine. Others suggested she had been kidnapped. But the idea of her simply vanishing into thin air seemed impossible. Emily's parents were beside themselves with grief. Her mother, a sweet, soft-spoken woman, spent her days in front of the TV, waiting for any news. Her father, a retired police officer, became more withdrawn, spending his hours pacing around their home, staring into the woods that surrounded their property. Emily had been their only child, and they couldn't understand why she would have gone missing. They had always known her to be cautious and level-headed, never one to take risks without considering the consequences. As the weeks turned into months, the search began to lose momentum. People had started to go back to their normal lives, trying to pretend as if everything was okay, even though deep down they knew something was wrong. The mystery of Emily's disappearance had become a scar on the town's soul, one that would never heal. It wasn't just a missing person case. It was something much darker. The worst part was that no one had any answers. The police had no leads. The search dogs had found nothing. And the blood-stained rag that had once been their only clue had only led them to more unanswered questions. What had happened to Emily Turner? And why was she taken from the people who loved her? Why had the woods claimed her? And what kind of monster could do such a thing? For some in Maple Creek, the question was no longer just about finding Emily. It was about confronting the terrifying reality that something evil was hiding in the woods. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. The trail of blood had led them to one conclusion. Emily's story was far from over, and the forest held more secrets than anyone could ever have imagined. As the days passed, the quiet that had once defined Maple Creek began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The search for Emily had been relentless, yet with every passing hour, the hope of finding her alive seemed to slip further away. Her parents, whose grief had already consumed them, could hardly sleep. Every night, they lay awake, tortured by nightmares that played out the same horrifying scene. Emily, calling for help, lost and alone in the woods, but no one could reach her. Each dream felt more real than the last, as though they were being dragged deeper into the nightmare they feared had already become their reality. The nights in Maple Creek had grown eerily quiet. The town, once bustling with the sounds of children playing and families gathering, was now a place of hushed conversations and anxious glances. Everyone had their own theory, their own idea of what might have happened to Emily. But no one knew for sure. The only thing that was certain was the absence that hung over the town, the dark cloud that seemed to cling to every corner. In the days that followed, rumors began to spread. People talked about strange noises coming from the woods at night, distant cries that sounded almost human, whispers that seemed to float on the breeze, carrying words no one could understand. Some said they had seen figures moving between the trees, their forms barely visible in the shadows. They spoke in hushed tones about a tall, dark silhouette that had been spotted near the edge of the forest, standing still, as if watching the town from the darkness. Others claimed they had heard footsteps following them, even when they were alone. The sound echoing just behind them, too close to be coincidental, but never quite there. No one could say for certain what it was, but the stories persisted, and with each new account, fear began to take root in the hearts of the townspeople. Despite the growing panic, no one could prove anything. The rumors remained just that, rumors. No one had seen anything concrete, no hard evidence to back up the strange tales. The police kept their efforts focused on the search, though their determination had begun to wane. They scoured the woods daily, but each day felt more hopeless than the last. The trail that had once seemed so promising, the blood-stained rag, had led them nowhere. No one had found anything remotely close to a clue that could point to what had happened to Emily. And as the days turned into weeks, the search seemed to lose its momentum. The town's collective anxiety shifted from hope to fear, and then to something darker, something that gnawed at the edges of the community's sanity. But then came the discovery. It was another routine search, a group of volunteers trekking deeper into the forest, hoping for anything that might offer a shred of hope. They had been searching the same stretch of trees for days, cutting through thick underbrush and stepping carefully over fallen logs, when one of the searchers stumbled upon something that immediately stopped them in their tracks. It was a trail of blood, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't much, just a few drops here and there, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through the group. They had hoped to find Emily, but they hadn't expected this. The blood was fresh, too fresh to ignore. It led them deeper into the woods, winding through the trees and disappearing into the thick brush. The group moved cautiously, following the trail. As they walked, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive silence. No birds chirped, no rustling of leaves. The only sound was the crunch of twigs underfoot, the occasional crackle of branches breaking as they pushed through the undergrowth. The trail seemed almost too clean, too deliberate. There were no signs of struggle, no trampled grass or torn clothing, just the steady trickle of blood leading them forward. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the experience became. The forest around them seemed to close in, as though the trees themselves were watching. Their branches twisted and gnarled like reaching hands. The once familiar woods had turned into something darker, something foreign and ominous. The blood trail led them to a clearing where they saw something they hadn't expected. A cabin, hidden from view, standing at the edge of the woods like a forgotten relic. Its wood was dark and weathered, the windows covered with grime and dirt. The door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. The group hesitated. There was something about the cabin that didn't sit right. It looked abandoned, but there was a strange energy about it, a sense that something or someone was waiting. But they couldn't ignore the trail. It had led them here, and they had to know what it meant. As they approached the cabin, the air grew colder. A chill ran down the backs of the searchers as they stepped over the threshold. Inside, the cabin was dark. Only faint light filtering in through the grimy windows. The smell was thick, a mixture of decay and something else, something sharp and metallic. The floorboards creaked underfoot as they carefully moved through the space, their flashlights sweeping across the room. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, peeling in places. There was a fireplace on one side of the room, the hearth cold and empty. The furniture was sparse, consisting of a few worn chairs and a rickety table. But it wasn't the furniture that drew their attention. It was the strange symbols painted on the walls, crude and jagged, as if drawn in haste or desperation. Some of the symbols seemed to have been there for a long time, fading into the wood, while others looked fresher, still dark and unmistakably vivid against the peeling walls. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick, oppressive, as if the very air inside was heavy with something ancient and dark. One of the searchers made his way to the corner of the room, where a small, rusty metal box sat on the floor. His flashlight illuminated the old lock, the dust and grime that had settled around it. The other searchers moved closer, their curiosity piqued. But before anyone could open the box, a sound came from behind them. An unmistakable creak of a floorboard, followed by a thump. The group froze. There was no one else in the cabin, or so they thought. A strange sensation washed over them, like being watched. The blood trail, the symbols, the eerie silence, it all seemed too much to be coincidence. The group had only just begun to comprehend the gravity of their discovery, when one of the searchers turned to face the door. A figure stood in the threshold, tall, shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness, just barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its presence was wrong, unnatural. The air in the room thickened, as if the very space was closing in on them. No one moved. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, slipping back into the shadows of the woods. The searchers stood there in stunned silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had no answers, only more questions. The blood trail, the cabin, the figure in the doorway. It was all too much, too overwhelming to comprehend. They had come searching for Emily, but what they had found was something far more terrifying than they could have imagined. The woods were no longer just a place of peace and quiet. They had become a place of death, of darkness, of something ancient and evil. The truth was clear. The trail wasn't just about Emily. It was a warning. And whatever had taken her, it was still out there, waiting. The cabin loomed ahead, barely visible through the dense underbrush that surrounded it. It was old, its wood gray and weathered by time, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Moss and vines had claimed much of its exterior, creeping up the walls and over the door, as though nature itself had tried to swallow it whole. The silence around it felt unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The search team paused at the edge of the clearing, their torches flickering in the still air. They had been following the blood trail for hours, but something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the isolation or the darkness of the forest that made them hesitate. It was something deeper, a sense of unease that clung to the cabin like a shadow. They knew they had to go in. The blood trail had led them here, and though they feared what they might find, there was no turning back. As they made their way toward the cabin, the air grew colder, the wind carrying a faint smell, something foul, like rotting meat. It made their stomachs churn, but they pressed on, each step crunching loudly against the fallen leaves and debris. The door creaked open with a painful groan, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the unmistakable stench of decay. It was so heavy that it seemed to press against their lungs, making it hard to breathe. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The cabin was dim, but even in the low light, it was clear, that this place had been abandoned for a long time. The floor was covered in layers of grime, and the walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that had peeled away in places, revealing the bare wood underneath. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the cabin itself was waiting for them. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that sent a shiver down their spines. It was the feeling of something else lurking here. Something unseen, but very much present. As they moved further into the cabin, the first thing they noticed was the photographs. Hanging on the walls, their edges curling and yellowed with age, were pictures of people none of them recognized. There was something eerie about them. The people in the photos had vacant, almost hollow expressions, their eyes staring directly at the camera, as if they knew something the world didn't. Some of the pictures were taken outdoors, others inside homes. But all of them had one thing in common. They seemed to belong to another time, another place. But what was most disturbing was how they seemed to be staring right back at the searchers, their gaze following them as they moved through the room. The more they looked, the more uneasy they became. There was a sense of wrongness to these photos, like they were meant to be there, like they had been placed with intent. They didn't linger on the pictures for long. Their attention was quickly drawn to the floor, where strange symbols had been scrawled in what appeared to be chalk or paint. Some were simple, abstract shapes, while others were complex, intricate patterns that seemed to have no clear meaning. It was as if a ritual had taken place here, something dark and twisted. The symbols seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, an unsettling presence that made the air feel even heavier. The searchers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, each of them aware of the strange force that seemed to fill the room. In the corner of the cabin, a small wooden table stood, its surface scratched and worn. The flashlight beams swept over it, revealing something that made their stomachs drop: a blood-stained knife. The blade was long, its metal darkened with dried blood, and it lay discarded on the table, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. No one said a word, but the implications were clear. Emily had been here. The blood on the knife was fresh, too fresh to ignore. And yet, there was no sign of her anywhere in the cabin. The search team exchanged nervous looks, each of them wondering if they were standing in the very place where she had been held. Had she been brought here? Had she been forced to endure whatever dark ritual had taken place? They could only guess, but the evidence was damning. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. As they explored the back of the cabin, one of the searchers pushed open a door that seemed almost too small to notice. It was hidden in the corner, tucked away behind a stack of old crates and broken furniture. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small room, so small that it was barely big enough for one person to stand comfortably. Inside, the air was even thicker, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. The walls of the room were covered in more symbols, some overlapping with the ones from the main cabin, while others were entirely new, more intricate, more disturbing. But it wasn't the symbols that made their hearts race. It was the bloodstains. The floor was covered in dark, dried blood, some of it smeared as if someone had been dragged across the room. It looked like there had been a struggle, a violent, desperate struggle. There were more signs of violence, small objects that had been knocked over in a hurry, and one particularly disturbing mark on the wall. It was a message, hastily written in what appeared to be the same dark substance that stained the floor. The words were jagged, scrawled with such force that they almost seemed to rip through the wood. The blood never lies. The words hung in the air, as if they were meant to haunt anyone who read them. The message was simple, but its meaning was impossible to ignore. It was a chilling statement, as though someone or something was trying to tell them something. The blood, it seemed, was the only truth in this place. But what truth? Was it a warning? A confession? Or something even darker? Something that the cabin itself had been hiding for years. The team stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding. No one spoke, but the weight of the discovery pressed down on them. Emily was here. Of that much they were certain. But what had happened to her? What kind of nightmare had she been forced to endure in this small, filthy room? And who had left the message on the wall? The blood never lies. What did that even mean? The questions flooded their minds, but there were no answers. Only more darkness, more confusion. And as they left the room, stepping back into the main cabin, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. It was as if the cabin itself was watching them, waiting for something. They had come looking for answers, but what they had found only deepened the mystery. The blood trail, the knife, the strange symbols, and the message on the wall were all clues, but they led to more questions than answers. And the most terrifying thought of all was that the answers they sought might be worse than the questions. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing hour, the search for Emily became more desperate. The once bustling town of Maple Creek, filled with whispers and rumors, had fallen into an uneasy silence. The hopeful optimism that had initially accompanied the search efforts had long since given way to a chilling realization. Emily's disappearance was not just an unfortunate accident. It was something far more sinister, despite the tireless work of local law enforcement and volunteers. No new leads had emerged. The forest had given up its secrets, and the blood trail had led them nowhere. It was beginning to seem as though Emily had simply vanished from the face of the earth, swallowed up by the darkness of the woods. The sheriff's department, though still committed to finding her, was running out of options. They had searched the entire area, scoured the nearby lakes and rivers, even brought in forensic teams to analyze the smallest details. But nothing had panned out. As the case grew colder, the town began to move on, albeit uneasily. Emily's parents were beside themselves, consumed by grief. But even they began to lose hope. What could have happened to their daughter? Was she still out there? Or had something darker claimed her? Then, out of nowhere, a tip arrived. It came in the form of an anonymous phone call to the police station late one evening. The voice on the other end was trembling, a hint of fear in every word. The caller claimed to have seen someone lurking around the cabin. The same cabin that the search team had found days earlier, just before Emily had gone missing. The man was described as tall, with a rugged appearance, and his presence had been unsettling. But it wasn't the description that grabbed the officers' attention. It was the name the caller gave, Carl Miller. Carl Miller was a name that no one in Maple Creek had thought about in years. He was a former local resident, a man who had lived in the town for most of his life, but one who had long since disappeared. It had been over a decade since anyone had heard from Carl. He was a quiet, reclusive man, often keeping to himself and staying out of the way of others. He didn't have any close friends, and his interactions with the town were few and far between. But that wasn't what made people remember him. What made him memorable were the rumors that always seemed to follow him. Over the years, there had been strange stories about Carl. People whispered about him when they thought no one was listening. Some said he had a dark temper, that he'd once been involved in violent altercations, but nothing had ever been proven. There were also whispers about his obsession with the woods, that he'd spent long hours in the forest, talking to himself, as if trying to communicate with something unseen. Others claimed that he had a collection of strange objects, oddities that he kept locked away in his home, though no one could say for certain. And then, one day, Carl simply disappeared. No one knew why or where he had gone, but it was as though he had vanished without a trace. The police were skeptical at first. It seemed almost too convenient that the person they had been looking for had suddenly reappeared in the form of a long-forgotten man with a troubled past. But as they followed the lead, things began to take a more sinister turn. The tipster had provided just enough information for the police to begin tracking Carl's whereabouts. They learned that he had returned to the area in the past few months after being gone for over a decade. Carl's return was marked by an unsettling pattern. Neighbors in the area spoke of strange behavior. He rarely left his property, and when he did, it was only for short trips into the woods. His house, located deep in the forest, was isolated from the rest of the town, and the few people who had tried to approach him had been met with cold, distant responses. No one dared to get too close, and no one seemed to know exactly what Carl had been up to in the years since his disappearance. But whatever it was clear that something had changed. He was no longer the quiet, solitary man he once was. There was a darkness about him now, a palpable sense of something hidden deep within. The police tracked Carl down to his home, located on the outskirts of town, nestled deep in the woods. The house was eerily quiet when they arrived, the only sound, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The air around the house was thick with an oppressive silence, and it seemed as though the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just the isolation of the house that was unsettling. It was the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out of place. When they entered the house, the atmosphere inside was even more disturbing. The walls were covered in photographs, old and new, each one of people, none of whom the officers recognized. Some of the photos were blurry, faded. Others were clear and sharp, but all of them had one thing in common. They all depicted the same faces, the same people in various states of distress. The photos were tacked haphazardly to the walls, as if they had been placed in a hurry, and they seemed to tell a story that no one could understand. But it wasn't just the photos that disturbed the police. It was the strange drawings that covered the walls. The drawings were not simple doodles. They were intricate, disturbing images of twisted shapes and symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. Some looked like they belonged to ancient rituals, while others were almost childlike, with jagged lines and spirals that gave off a sense of madness. The officers couldn't make sense of them. But one thing was clear. Carl Miller was obsessed with something or someone. As they moved through the house, the sense of unease grew stronger. It was clear that Carl had been living in a world of his own, a world that seemed disconnected from reality. There was an overwhelming sense of madness in the air, and the officers couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding on something dark and dangerous. As they reached the back of the house, they found a locked door. When they broke it open, they discovered a room that sent chills down their spines. The room was small, cramped and filled with more photographs, more drawings, and something else, something far more disturbing. There were remnants of things that looked like personal belongings, including clothes, a pair of shoes, and a small, blood-stained cloth. The blood on the cloth was fresh, too fresh to be ignored. And it was clear that someone had been here recently. The room seemed like a shrine, a place where Carl had been keeping something, or someone. It was impossible to tell, but the evidence was there, and it was enough to confirm the police's worst fears. Carl Miller had returned, and he had brought something with him. Something dark, something twisted. His obsession had only grown over the years, and now it seemed that his return to Maple Creek was no coincidence. The bloodstains, the photographs, the drawings, they all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Carl Miller was involved in Emily's disappearance, and whatever he had been hiding in that cabin was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The police had found their suspect, but they had also uncovered something much darker. A man driven by obsession. A man who had been living in a world of madness, and one who would stop at nothing to fulfill whatever twisted desire had brought him back to the woods. When Carl Miller was finally apprehended, it didn't come as the dramatic standoff that one might expect. There was no desperate resistance or defiant fight against the officers who had been searching for him for weeks. Instead, he surrendered without so much as a word of protest. His face was eerily calm, as though the weight of his actions had already been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't seem anxious or fearful of the consequences. Instead, he seemed almost relieved. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, ready to finally unload the truth that had been festering inside him for so long. His lack of resistance, his almost serene demeanor, sent chills down the spine of the officers who surrounded him. They had expected fear, guilt, maybe even anger, but what they got instead was something far colder, more chilling. He spoke freely, as though the confession was long overdue, and in his words, they found something far darker. Carl began to speak in a detached, almost disinterested tone. His voice, though steady, was laced with a strange calmness that was unsettling. "The woods aren't just woods," he said, his eyes glazed over, as though he were speaking of something far beyond the trees and foliage. "They've always been a place of power, a place where things older than us exist. Things we don't understand, but they've always been there." The officers exchanged confused glances. What was he talking about? The woods were simply a backdrop to the crime, a remote location where Emily had been taken. But Carl didn't see it that way. To him, the woods were a living entity, something far more than just trees and wildlife. According to him, it was a place of ritual, steeped in ancient practices that had been carried on by a select few, hidden from the eyes of the rest of the world. As Carl continued to speak, the officers began to understand that the blood trail they had followed, the one that led them to the cabin and through the darkened forest, wasn't just the aftermath of a random attack. No, Carl explained. It was part of something much larger, something far more disturbing. The blood, the sacrifice, it wasn't just a crime. It was a ritual, one that had been passed down through generations. Carl's voice dropped lower as he revealed the horror of the tradition. "This is what we do," he said, his words almost clinical. "It's been done before. It's how we honor what's in the woods. The blood is a sacrifice, a binding, and Emily was chosen." The officers felt the weight of his words sink in. Chosen? The implications were horrifying. Who or what could choose someone for such a fate? And why? But Carl didn't offer any further explanation as to why Emily had been chosen, nor did he offer any insight into how this process worked. To him, it seemed so simple, so natural. She had crossed a line, unknowingly, and that was all it took. In Carl's mind, there was no need for a deeper reason or understanding. This was simply the way it was. The ritual required a sacrifice, and Emily had been unfortunate enough to find herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was no malice, no personal vendetta, just the cruel mechanics of an ancient tradition. He told them, without remorse, how he had brought Emily to the cabin. She had fought, of course. She had screamed, struggled against him, but Carl had been prepared for that. He had restrained her, keeping her locked away in the small, filthy room for days. During that time, she had no idea what was about to happen to her. She had been terrified, yes, but she hadn't yet realized that she had become a pawn in something much bigger than herself. Carl spoke of the days in that cabin with a chilling indifference, as though it were a story he had told many times before. He described how she had begged for release, how she had cried out for help, but none came. The blood trail, he said, was only the beginning, a small part of a larger, more complex ritual. But then Carl's tone shifted. For the first time in their conversation, there was a hint of something else, a flicker of emotion that was neither guilt nor regret, but something more unsettling. His voice wavered slightly as he explained that the ritual had gone wrong. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he muttered. I wasn't supposed to do it alone. The officers listened, leaning in as Carl's story took a darker turn. The ritual had been interrupted, but not by Emily. No, it was something else, someone else. Carl paused, his gaze shifting, as though he were lost in the memory. I didn't finish it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone else took her. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken horror. It was clear now that Emily hadn't been killed by Carl. She hadn't been the victim of some random act of violence. No, Carl had not finished the ritual, and someone, or something else, had intervened. The officers pressed him for more details, but Carl remained tight-lipped, his eyes haunted by whatever it was that had taken over the ritual. It wasn't supposed to end like that, he repeated, his voice strained. The ritual needs to be completed, and it's not over. Not yet. The truth, as Carl revealed it, was unfathomable. He had started the ritual, but it wasn't just him who was involved in this twisted tradition. There were others, hidden figures, shadowy presences in the forest, who had claimed their part of the ritual. Carl had brought Emily to the cabin, and he had kept her there, waiting for the right moment. But the ritual demanded more, something deeper, something beyond Carl's control. It wasn't just about the blood. It was about the completion of a cycle, something that had been going on for generations. Emily, unknowingly, had crossed the line into this ancient world, and she had become a part of something that had been going on for far too long. And then, in the middle of Carl's confession, he revealed something that chilled the officers to their core. You don't understand, he said, his voice dropping lower. The ritual isn't just about blood. It's about control, power, And when it's interrupted, when it isn't finished, he trailed off, his words fading into the air. But the meaning was clear. There were forces at play that no one could understand, forces far darker than Carl had ever anticipated. He had started the ritual, but it wasn't finished. And the worst part, Emily wasn't the only one. She was just one in a long line of victims, each of whom had unknowingly become part of a dark, sadistic tradition. As Carl's confession continued, the officers felt the weight of his words press down on them. Emily's fate had been sealed the moment she stepped into those woods. But what Carl had unleashed, what he had started, was something much bigger, something that wasn't finished. There were others out there, and the blood trail, the ritual, would continue. No one knew how long it had been going on, but Carl had made it clear. The woods weren't just a hiding place. They were a home for something ancient, something terrifying. And whatever it was, it had claimed Emily. The officers had learned the truth, but it was a truth that had no easy answers, no way to stop what was coming next. The ritual wasn't over, and it might never be. Emily's body was never found. Despite Carl's confession, despite all the efforts of the police and the search parties that had scoured the woods for weeks, there was no trace of her. No remains, no sign that she had ever been there. The blood trail had led them to the cabin, to Carl, to the gruesome realization that something ancient and horrifying had taken place. But it never gave them the closure they so desperately needed. Emily had simply vanished. The woods had swallowed her whole, and the more they searched, the more it seemed as though the forest itself was conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. The town of Maple Creek was never the same after that night. What had once been a quiet, idyllic place where families knew each other and life moved at a slow, peaceful pace was now a town gripped by fear and suspicion. The woods, which had once been a source of beauty and escape for many, had become something else entirely. A place of darkness, a place of death. And no one could escape the whispers. It started with the rumors about the blood trail, the trail that had led to Carl's cabin, and from there to the revelation that something far darker was at play in those woods. People would speak of it in hushed tones, in the privacy of their homes, never daring to say it out loud when someone might hear. The blood trail, they called it. Some claimed it was an omen, a warning, while others believed it was something more, a path that led straight into the heart of the darkness that had taken. Despite the official investigations, despite the confessions and the countless hours spent searching, no one ever truly knew what had happened to Emily. Some people insisted that the trail of blood continued, winding its way deeper into the woods until it reached a place where no human should ever go. A place that was untouched by the laws of nature and time. Others whispered that the forest itself had claimed her. that the spirits of the land had taken her as part of some ancient, terrifying pact. The idea that Emily had been taken by something beyond the physical realm, something supernatural, seemed to offer the only answer that made any sense in the aftermath of Carl's cryptic confession. The woods were no longer just a place on the map. They had become something alive, something with a mind of its own, something that had been waiting for Emily to wander too far into its depths. But no one could say for certain. The blood trail had ended, but the questions only grew. Where had Emily gone? What had happened to her? And what about the other victims Carl had mentioned? Had they all shared the same fate? The town had heard rumors about missing people over the years, rumors that had always been brushed aside as accidents or disappearances. But now, with Carl's chilling revelations, the possibility that these were not just random events, but part of a larger, darker tradition seemed all too real. The town had no answers, no closure, only fear. People who lived near the woods began to report strange occurrences. It started with the footsteps. Late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, some claimed to hear the sound of footsteps behind them, following them as they walked along the outskirts of town. The sound was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it was always there. Someone or something walking just behind them, just out of sight. People would turn around, their hearts racing, but there was never anyone there. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the empty road stretching out before them. But that didn't stop the feeling that someone was watching, that something was waiting. And then came the whispers, soft at first, just on the edge of hearing, carried by the breeze through the trees. People who wandered too close to the woods said they could hear the whispers, strange voices that seemed to echo in their minds, as though the forest itself was speaking to them. Some tried to convince themselves it was just the wind, the rustling of the leaves, but there was no denying the sense of unease that hung over the woods now. The feeling that something or someone was always there, just out of sight, watching and waiting. The closer they got to the woods, the more the whispers seemed to grow, until they could no longer ignore them. And for some, the whispers began to speak directly to them, to call their names. The more the residents of Maple Creek tried to forget, the more the memories of Emily's disappearance and the blood trail seemed to haunt them. The town had tried to return to normal, to go back to the quiet, simple life they once knew, but they couldn't. The woods were always there, just beyond the town's edge, a constant reminder of the terror that had unfolded. No one could walk through the forest now without feeling a shiver of fear. No one could look at the trees without wondering what lay hidden in the darkness beneath their branches. The police, too, struggled to move forward. They had spent so many hours searching, so much time chasing leads that had only led them back to square one. The search for Emily had turned into something else entirely. An obsession with the unknown, with the thing that had taken her. No one could explain what had happened, not with any certainty. Carl's confession had given them the smallest hint, but it had only led to more questions. What had started as an investigation into a missing person had turned into something far bigger, something far darker. The woods had become a place of evil, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred, and the possibility of something ancient and terrifying living in the shadows had become all too real. Over time, the town grew quieter. People who had once lived peacefully in Maple Creek now spoke of leaving. They didn't want to risk being the next victim, being drawn into the mystery that seemed to stretch back into the forest's dark history. They left for other towns, for cities where the shadows didn't feel so long, where the air didn't carry the weight of things unseen. Those who stayed behind kept to themselves, never venturing too far into the woods, and always looking over their shoulders just in case. But still, the blood trail remains. Some say it's nothing more than a myth, a story passed down from one generation to the next. But for those who still live in Maple Creek, who remember the terror that took Emily, the trail is all too real. The footsteps in the night, the whispers in the wind, the feeling that the woods are waiting for the next unlucky soul. They are all too real. And as much as they try to forget, the truth is this: no one knows what really happened to Emily. No one knows what happened to the other victims. And perhaps that's the greatest horror of all. Because whatever it is that lurks in those woods, it's still out there, waiting, watching, and ready to claim the next one. And no one knows when the blood trail will start again.